In October of 1911, a bomb went off accidentally in a rented safe house in the city of Hankou in the Wuhan region of central China. It was not supposed to go off. The bomb was being carefully assembled by a group of revolutionary activists, young soldiers, students, and organizers who had been quietly building an underground cell network within the units of China's modernized new army. And it went off prematurely, before it was ready, in a moment of terrible bad luck that probably involved a cigarette and a pile of detonators. The explosion was heard by neighbors. The neighbors called the police. The police arrived and discovered not just bomb-making equipment, but something far more dangerous: detailed membership lists, organizational documents, and stamps of the revolutionary network operating within the military garrisons of Wuhan. The names on those lists belonged to soldiers and officers of the new army, men trained to defend the imperial government, who were now going to be arrested and executed for treason. They had a choice: submit to arrest and face certain death, or act immediately and hope that the revolution would succeed before the government could crush it. They chose to act. In the early morning hours of October 10th, 1911, units of the new army in Wuchang, one of the three cities that make up modern Wuhan, mutinied against their officers, seized the governor's official residence, and took control of the armory. By dawn, the revolutionary flag was flying over one of the most strategically important cities in central China. And within the next 6 weeks, 15 of China's 24 provinces declared independence from the imperial government in Beijing. And within 4 months, exactly 124 days from that accidental bomb explosion to the final document being signed, the longest-lived political system in the history of human civilization formally ended. The Chinese imperial system, which had governed the territory of China continuously since 221 BCE, which had survived the fall of dozens of dynasties, which had weathered conquest by the Mongols and domination by the Manchus, which had endured internal rebellions that killed tens of millions of people and external humiliations that stripped away territory and treasure, which had been the organizing principle of one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated civilizations for 2,133 years, ended because a bomb went off by accident in a rented room and a group of frightened soldiers decided to shoot their way out of the consequences. That is the immediate cause. The actual causes go much deeper, and they had been building for 7 decades, and the story of how a civilization as ancient and as deeply rooted as imperial China arrived at that moment of accidental self-destruction is one of the most remarkable and instructive stories in the history of the modern world. To understand the true scale of what was lost in February of 1912, you have to first understand what the Chinese imperial system actually was, and how completely without parallel in human experience it was. In the year 221 BCE, after approximately 2.5 centuries of almost continuous warfare among the competing states of what the Chinese called the Warring States period, the king of the Qin state, the westernmost and most aggressive of the 7 major competing kingdoms, completed the military conquest of all his rivals and unified the territory of China under a single ruler for the first time in history. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence and terrifying ruthlessness, and he understood immediately that he needed a new title, a title that would convey an authority unlike anything that had existed before, something that went beyond the traditional title of king, which all his defeated rivals had also held. He invented a new compound word, Huangdi, usually translated into English as emperor. This term combined the titles of the 3 legendary sage kings of Chinese antiquity and the 5 legendary divine emperors. It was meant to convey that this ruler combined in himself all the virtue and authority that the Chinese tradition associated with the greatest rulers who had ever governed. He gave himself the specific epithet Qin Shi Huangdi, the first August emperor of Qin. He then proceeded to systematically dismantle everything that might threaten the imperial unity he had created. He standardized the written Chinese script so that officials across the empire could communicate regardless of their regional dialect. He standardized weights and measures. He standardized the currency. He standardized the axle width of carts so they would all fit the same ruts and the same roads throughout the empire. He burned books that he considered politically dangerous. He buried alive hundreds of Confucian scholars who questioned his policies. He mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers to connect existing border walls into the first version of what would eventually become the Great Wall. He began constructing a vast mausoleum for himself under a hill near the old Qin capital. a mausoleum that contained, among many other wonders, a full-scale terracotta army of 8,000 soldiers, horses, and chariots standing in battle formation, guarding the emperor through eternity, not discovered by the outside world until 1974. He was extraordinary and terrible in equal measure, and he ruled for only 11 years before dying from mercury poisoning. He had been drinking mercury-based potions his alchemists promised would make him immortal, on a journey away from his capital in 210 BCE. His dynasty lasted barely 4 more years after his death before collapsing into civil war. But the imperial system he had created, the fundamental political idea that a single supreme ruler, the Son of Heaven, governed all of China through a centralized bureaucratic apparatus staffed by men selected through demonstrated competence, outlasted not only the Qing Dynasty but every single dynasty that followed it for more than 2,000 years. Dynasties rose and fell. Conquerors arrived from the northern steppes and the Manchurian forests. The capital moved between cities. The borders of the empire expanded to incorporate Tibet and Central Asia and Vietnam, then contracted, then expanded again. Languages evolved. Buddhism arrived from India and transformed Chinese spiritual life. Islam arrived and created substantial communities in the northwest and southwest. The arts changed, and the architecture changed, and the cuisine changed, and the fashions changed. The imperial system endured. The Han Dynasty governed for 4 centuries. The Tang Dynasty created what many Chinese still consider the golden age of their civilization. The Song Dynasty developed the world's first true market economy, printing technology, gunpowder weapons, and the magnetic compass. The Yuan Dynasty was founded by Kublai Khan after the Mongol conquest, the only time in Chinese history that the entire country was ruled by a foreign conqueror. But even the Mongols governed through a modified version of the imperial system they had conquered. The Ming Dynasty drove out the Mongols and built much of the Great Wall that tourists see today, and sent the treasure fleets of Zheng He across the Indian Ocean to Arabia and East Africa in the early 15th century, a Chinese maritime exploration program that was quietly discontinued before it could change world history. The imperial examination system, the practice of selecting government officials through competitive written tests of their mastery of Confucian classical texts, which gave talented men from ordinary families a genuine pathway to power and prestige based on merit rather than birth, was formalized under the Sui dynasty around 605 CE and continued in essentially the same form for 1,300 years, until it was finally abolished in 1905. No institution in the history of any other civilization on Earth came close to matching that duration. The Chinese imperial system was not merely the world's oldest empire in 1912. It was, by a margin so large that comparison seems almost meaningless, the most enduring, most sophisticated, and most consistently effective political system the human species had ever developed. The last dynasty to inherit and operate this system was the Qing, and they were not Han Chinese. The Manchus were a people of the forests and river valleys of Manchuria, the territory northeast of the Great Wall, who had built their own increasingly sophisticated political and military organization through the first decades of the 17th century under a series of capable and ambitious leaders. They had created their own alphabet and their own bureaucratic institutions, and they had been conducting increasingly successful raids against the Ming Dynasty for decades. When the Ming finally collapsed in the 1640s, destroyed by a combination of peasant rebellions driven by famine and fiscal collapse, military defeat on multiple fronts, and the catastrophic incompetence of the last Ming emperor, the Manchus were positioned to take advantage. In 1644, a Ming loyalist general named Wu Sangui made a decision that changed Chinese history for the next 268 years. Faced with the peasant rebel Li Zisheng, who had just captured Beijing and driven the last Ming emperor to hang himself from a coal tree in the imperial garden behind the Forbidden City, Wu Sangui invited the Manchu army through the Shanhai Pass in the Great Wall, intending to use them as temporary allies against the rebels. The Manchus came through the pass, defeated Li Zisheng in battle, and then simply kept going. They declared the establishment of a new dynasty, the Qing, meaning pure or clear, and systematically conquered the rest of China over the following decades. They were a tiny minority, perhaps 2 million Manchus governing what would become 300 million, then 400 million Han Chinese, Tibetans, Mongolians, Uyghurs, and dozens of other peoples. They managed this through a sophisticated mixture of cultural adoption and ethnic distinction that was ultimately unstable but functioned brilliantly for most of 2.5 centuries. They adopted the Confucian imperial system wholesale, became patrons of Chinese art and literature and scholarship, produced emperors who wrote elegant classical Chinese poetry, and commissioned the compilation of the entire body of Chinese literature into a single vast imperial library. But they also maintained their distinctness through specific institutions and policies, the most visible and most bitterly resented of which was the queue. Every Han Chinese man was required, on pain of death, to shave the front of his head and wear the remaining hair in the Manchu style, a single long braid hanging down the back. The slogan used to enforce this policy in the early years of the conquest was brutal and direct. Keep your hair and lose your head, or keep your head and lose your hair. The queue became, for the Manchus, a visible daily test of submission that they required of the population they governed. For Han Chinese revolutionaries, 2.5 centuries later, publicly cutting the queue, which thousands of young men did after the Wuchang Uprising, was one of the most powerful symbolic acts of the revolution, a physical declaration that the Manchu order was finished. At the height of Qing power, in the long reign of the Emperor Qianlong from 1735 to 1796, the dynasty governed the largest empire China had ever held, incorporating all of Tibet, Xinjiang, Outer Mongolia, and the traditional Han heartland, a territory of roughly 13 million square kilometers, larger than the contemporary United States. When the British East India Company sent Lord Macartney to Beijing in 1793 on an official embassy seeking trade privileges and a permanent diplomatic presence, Qianlong received him with magnificent condescension and dismissed his requests. China was the center of civilization. It had no need of what Britain offered. He wrote King George III a letter of gentle correction. Your earnest desire to partake of the benefits of our civilization is well noted. However, there is nothing that we lack, and therefore there is no need for your goods. Less than 50 years later, that proud and magnificent civilization was being torn open by British gunboats. The First Opium War of 1839 to 1842 is often taught as a story about drugs and trade and imperialism, and it was all of those things. But it was also the moment when the fundamental technological and military gap between Qing China and industrializing Europe became impossible to deny or dismiss. The proximate cause was opium. The British East India Company had discovered, starting in the late 18th century, that the most profitable thing they could sell to China was opium grown in Bengal. Because China had little that Britain wanted but silver, and the opium trade was a way to reverse that balance. By the 1830s, hundreds of thousands of Chinese were addicted to opium. The silver was flowing out of China in alarming quantities, and the Qing court understood that it faced both a public health catastrophe and an economic crisis simultaneously. The Daoguang Emperor appointed a remarkable official named Lin Zexu, commissioner, scholar, and one of the most capable administrators the king produced in the 19th century, to go to Canton and end the opium trade. Lin Zexu did not negotiate or temporize. He confiscated every ounce of British opium he could find, over 1.25 million kilograms of it, worth millions of pounds sterling, and had it all destroyed, mixed with lime and salt and flushed into the sea over the course of 23 days. It was one of the most decisive and morally justified acts of a Qing official in the 19th century. The British response was to send a naval expedition. The Qing military, which had not been seriously tested against a Western power, proved catastrophically inadequate. Chinese war junks, beautiful, traditional, and about 2 centuries behind British naval technology, were outranged and outgunned by steam-powered warships with rifled cannons. Shore batteries mounted on fixed fortifications could not adjust quickly enough to track maneuvering steam vessels. Chinese soldiers fighting with weapons and tactics that had not fundamentally changed since the Ming Dynasty faced British infantry with accurate rifles and artillery that could decimate formations at ranges that made Chinese counterfire useless. The war lasted from 1839 to 1842 and ended in comprehensive Chinese defeat. The Treaty of Nanjing that concluded it was the first of what the Chinese would call the unequal treaties. China ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain permanently, opened 5 ports to British trade and residence, paid an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, and granted British subjects in China the right of extraterritoriality, meaning that British people in China were subject to British law, not Chinese law, even when they were on Chinese soil committing crimes against Chinese people. The principle of extraterritoriality was perhaps the most psychologically devastating element of the entire settlement. It declared, in legal language, that Chinese sovereignty did not fully apply in China, that the Middle Kingdom's laws were not good enough to govern the people of the nation that had just invaded it and forced it to sign a treaty at gunpoint. Within years, France, the United States, Russia, and other powers had extracted similar treaty rights through a combination of negotiation, threat, and occasional military action, the treaty port system. The network of cities where foreign nationals lived under their own law in their own enclaves, where foreign businesses operated under foreign protection, where the Qing government's writ did not fully run, spread and deepened over the following decades, carving the Chinese body politic into zones of varying sovereignty and creating a visual, daily demonstration of Chinese powerlessness in Chinese cities. The Taiping Rebellion, which devastated China from 1850 to 1864, was in some ways even more catastrophic for the long-term survival of the Qing than the Opium Wars, precisely because the Qing survived it. Hong Xiuquan had failed the imperial examination 4 times. The examination system, remember, was not merely a credentialing exercise. It was the primary pathway by which ambitious, intelligent men from ordinary families could rise to status, wealth, and power in imperial China. To fail, it repeatedly was to have your life's ambitions definitively rejected by the system that organized Chinese society. After his 4th failure in 1843, Hong Xiuquan experienced a serious mental breakdown and fell into a period of fever and visions. When he recovered, he encountered pamphlets produced by a Protestant missionary that explained the basic outlines of Christian theology, and he reinterpreted his visions through this new framework. He concluded that God had appeared to him and revealed that he, Hong Xiuquan, was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, a second son of God, tasked with driving the demons from China, which he identified with the Manchu Qing rulers, and establishing the Taiping Tianguo, the heavenly kingdom of great peace. He began preaching and gathering followers, first among his own Hakka people of Guangdong province, then more broadly among the rural poor of southern China. People who had ample reasons to want the existing order overturned. The Taiping movement grew with astonishing speed, producing an army, a capital at Nanjing, a government, a religion, and an alternative social order that rejected Confucianism, segregated men and women into separate military units, theoretically abolished private property, outlawed foot binding, opium, prostitution, and gambling, and organized millions of people around Hong Xiuquan's unique synthesis of biblical Christianity and Chinese millenarianism. The Qing court, already stretched by the aftermath of the Opium War, spent 14 years fighting the Taiping in a conflict that ranged across the most economically productive regions of central and southern China. The final suppression of the Taiping in 1864 was achieved only through the creation of new regional armies that were not traditional Qing bannermen. Armies raised and commanded by Han Chinese officials like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang, who recruited from their own personal networks, who paid their soldiers from locally raised funds rather than from the imperial treasury, and who built military organizations that owed their loyalty first to their commander and only second to the Qing court. The death toll of the Taiping Rebellion is estimated at between 20 and 30 million people, comparable to the losses of World War I across all belligerents in a single country over 14 years. The Qing survived, but the survival came at a price that was not immediately legible. Real military power in China had migrated from the Manchu Eight Banners and the Imperial Green Standard Army, both of which had demonstrated their inadequacy, to the new regional armies commanded by Han Chinese generals. The center's control over the periphery had been fundamentally, if not visibly, weakened. The First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 administered the most psychologically shattering blow yet. Japan, an island nation that the Qing had always regarded as a cultural dependency of the Chinese civilization, a place that had borrowed its writing system, its Buddhism, much of its court culture and governmental organization from China over the preceding millennium, had responded to American naval pressure to open its ports in 1853 by doing something that Qing China had conspicuously failed to do. It completely restructured itself. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was one of the most deliberate and successful programs of national transformation in the history of the modern world. Japan abolished the feudal samurai system, created a conscript national army on Prussian lines, built a modern navy, established a national educational system, drafted a constitution, created a parliament, built railways and telegraphs and factories, sent thousands of students to study in Europe and America, and then brought those graduates back to modernize Japanese institutions. It took 30 years, and by 1894, Japan had a military that was genuinely competitive with Western second-tier powers. China had attempted something called the self-strengthening movement, the program of modernization under the slogan Chinese learning for essence, Western learning for practical use. Chinese officials had built arsenals and shipyards and a modern-ish navy and some railways. But they had built these things without changing the fundamental political structure that they sat within, without reforming the examination system that selected the officials who would administer the arsenals and manage the budgets and make the decisions about how the new technologies would actually be used. The Beiyang Fleet, the northern naval squadron that was the jewel of Qing modernization, a collection of modern warships that had seemed imposing when commissioned, was largely destroyed in the Battle of the Yalu River in September 1894 by Japanese naval gunnery that was simply more accurate, better coordinated, and more aggressively commanded. The Treaty of Shimonoseki that ended the war in 1895 forced China to cede Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands to Japan permanently, recognize the independence of Korea, which meant Korean dependency on Japanese influence, and pay an indemnity of 200 million taels of silver, more than twice the annual revenue of the Qing central government. The reaction in China was a wave of shame, anger, and intellectual crisis. If Japan, which had learned everything it knew about civilization from China, could defeat China in war after 30 years of systematic westernization, what did that say about the Confucian system China had refused to fundamentally change? A new generation of Chinese intellectuals began arguing openly that the problem was not merely the weapons or the ships, but the entire political and intellectual framework that had produced the weapons and the ships and the men who commanded them. The 100 Days Reform of 1898 was the Qing court's one serious attempt to transform itself from within, and its catastrophic failure closed the door on that possibility forever. Emperor Guangzhou, a young man of genuine intelligence and good intentions who had been on the throne since childhood but had never been permitted to actually rule because Empress Dowager Cixi retained real power even in formal retirement, was inspired and advised by the reformer Kang Youwei, a Confucian scholar who had developed an elaborate argument that Confucius himself had been a reformer, and that genuine Confucianism required continuous institutional adaptation to changing circumstances. Between June and September of 1898, Guangzhou issued over 100 imperial edicts at a pace that bewildered and alarmed the Qing bureaucracy, creating new Western-style schools and universities, reorganizing and streamlining the bureaucracy, abolishing the thousands of sinecure positions that gave idle scholars and Manchu nobles a comfortable living without requiring any actual work, encouraging the military to train on modern lines, establishing a newspaper and translation bureau, proposing to send Chinese students abroad in systematic numbers. It was a program that, if implemented, might genuinely have given the imperial system enough adaptability to survive. Empress Dowager Cixi, advised by conservative Manchu courtiers who had everything to lose from bureaucratic streamlining, staged a coup in September 1898. She had Guangzhou placed under house arrest on the island of Yingtai in the South Sea Lake within the Zhongnanhai complex, a prisoner in the palace, surrounded by water, guarded day and night. 6 of Guangzhou's closest reformist advisors were arrested and publicly beheaded in Beijing. The 6 gentlemen of the reform movement, as they became known to subsequent generations. All but a handful of Guangzhou's reform edicts were rescinded within days. Kang Youwei escaped to Hong Kong and eventually to Japan. Liang Qichao, his brilliant student, also fled. They spent the next decade in exile, writing essays and founding journals that circulated among overseas Chinese communities and educated young Chinese people inside China, arguing with ever-increasing force that the Qing had proven itself incapable of meaningful reform and that the salvation of China required not reform of the imperial system but its replacement. The 100 Days Reform was not merely a failed attempt at modernization. It was a demonstration, visible to every Chinese person who was paying attention, that the imperial system could not survive the political changes necessary to make it competitive with the modern world. Cixi had preserved her power. She had done so at the cost of the dynasty. The Boxer catastrophe of 1900 was, in retrospect, almost perfectly designed to accelerate the collapse. The Yihetuan, translated variously as the righteous and harmonious fists, or simply the Boxers, were a millenarian organization from rural Shandong and Hebei that combined Chinese folk religion, martial arts traditions, and intense xenophobia. Their practitioners believed that ritual exercises made them invulnerable to foreign bullets, and they began attacking Christian missionaries, Chinese converts to Christianity, and the symbols of foreign presence across North China in 1899 and into 1900. CXE, advised by the most conservative elements of her court, made the catastrophic decision to officially support the Boxers and declare war on all foreign powers simultaneously. A declaration that the more realistic and capable governors in the southern and central provinces simply refused to implement, maintaining their own peace with foreign powers in the so-called mutual protection of the Southeast. Arrangement: the Eight-Nation Alliance. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, Japan, Italy, and Austro-Hungary organized a relief expedition that marched on Beijing, fighting its way through Chinese and Boxer forces, relieved the foreign legation quarter that had been under siege for 55 days, and proceeded to sack and loot the city with a thoroughness that Beijing had not experienced since the Mongol conquests. Cixi fled Beijing in a cart, disguised as a peasant woman, and made her way to Xi'an in the interior. The Boxer Protocol of September 1901 imposed an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, deliberately calculated at 1 tael per Chinese person, a symbolic humiliation as much as a financial penalty, to be paid over 39 years at 4% annual interest, meaning the total payment including interest would be close to 1 billion taels. The annual payments alone represented a sum larger than the Qing government's entire annual revenue from all sources. China would be making Boxer indemnity payments until 1940. The protocol also required the demolition of certain forts, the prohibition of arms imports for 2 years, the stationing of foreign troops in Beijing and along the road to the sea, and the punishment of officials who had supported the Boxers. The Qing government, already dependent on foreign loans, was now irrevocably financially dependent on foreign creditors who had every reason to prefer a weak and pliable Chinese government to a strong and assertive one. In the years after the Boxer catastrophe, Cixi finally implemented the new policies, the program of genuine modernization that she had suppressed in 1898 and that she now embraced because there was no other option. New schools teaching mathematics, science, and foreign languages were opened across China. The military was reorganized into a new army, the Xingkai Jun, trained by foreign advisors, equipped with modern weapons, organized on modern lines, and recruited from educated young men who could read and write rather than from the illiterate peasants who had filled the old armies. Provincial assemblies were created as a first step toward constitutional monarchy. A national assembly was convened. And in 1905, in the single most consequential political decision of the entire reform era, the imperial examination system was abolished. Cixi and her advisors understood, correctly, that an examination system that tested mastery of texts written 2,000 years earlier was not producing the kind of officials China needed to navigate the 20th century. What they did not fully calculate were the social consequences of abolishing the examination system without replacing it with a functional alternative pathway to elite status. The examination system had for 13 centuries been the great integrating institution of Chinese civilization, the mechanism by which the imperial state co-opted talented people from every social stratum into investment in the existing order. Men who had spent decades preparing for the examinations, men who had achieved lower-level degrees and were working toward higher ones, men who had organized their entire life around the prospect of official advancement through demonstrated learning. All of these people suddenly found themselves without a pathway. Their credentials were worthless. The social contract that had made the imperial system function, study hard, master the classics, serve the emperor, and you will be rewarded with status and salary, was unilaterally canceled. Into this vacuum poured a new educational system that sent students to Japan and Europe and America, where they encountered not just modern science and technology, but modern political philosophy. Republicanism, nationalism, socialism, anarchism, social Darwinism. The tens of thousands of Chinese students who studied in Japan between 1905 and 1911. Japan was cheap and geographically convenient, and it had modernized successfully using Western methods. Returned to China with ideas that the Qing imperial system had no framework to absorb. Many of them joined or financially supported Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary alliance, the Tongmenghui, which had been founded in Tokyo in 1905 as an umbrella organization for various anti-Qing groups. The Qing had created, through the combination of abolishing the examination system and failing to create an adequate alternative path to elite status, an entire generation of educated young men who had no stake in the survival of the imperial order and every reason to want its replacement. Sun Yat-sen was one of the most remarkable political figures in the history of the modern world. a man who was simultaneously visionary and impractical, inspiring and politically naive, genuinely principled and sometimes frustratingly idealistic. Born in 1866 near Guangzhou in Guangdong Province, educated partly in Hawaii under the care of an older brother who had emigrated there, trained as a medical doctor in Hong Kong, he had arrived at the conviction that the Qing Dynasty needed to be overthrown by the early 1890s. Well before most Chinese intellectuals had gone that far. He spent the years from 1895 onward in a form of permanent revolutionary exile, traveling constantly between Japan, Southeast Asia, Britain, the United States, and wherever else there were overseas Chinese communities to fundraise from and political contacts to cultivate. He organized and funded at least 10 revolutionary uprisings against the Qing between 1895 and 1911, every single one of which failed. He was sentenced to death by the Qing government, declared persona non grata in Japan at Qing request, briefly kidnapped and held in the Chinese legation in London before being released through the intervention of his old medical school teacher, hunted across multiple continents. Through all of it, he continued to develop and articulate his three principles of the people: Minzu, nationalism and the recovery of Chinese sovereignty; Mingquan, democracy and a republican constitutional government; and Minsheng, the people's livelihood, which included various progressive social and economic policies. He was in Denver, Colorado, in October 1911, having dinner and reading an American newspaper when he learned about the Wuchang uprising. He did not immediately rush back to China. He first traveled to Washington, D.C. to lobby the State Department not to recognize the Qing government or support it financially, then to London to make the same argument to the British Foreign Office, then to Paris. He was a strategist as well as a revolutionary, and he understood that foreign intervention on the Qing side could still save the dynasty if the great powers chose to act. By the time he finally arrived back in China in late December 1911, the revolution had largely won without him. He was inaugurated as the first provisional president of the Republic of China in Nanjing on January 1, 1912. The date was deliberately chosen, the first day of the new Western calendar year, a statement that the new China would orient itself to the international world. The Wuchang uprising and the cascade of provincial defections that followed it illustrated perfectly how hollow the Qing political structure had become by 1911. The provincial assemblies that declared independence were bodies the Qing had itself created as part of the constitutional reform process. Representative institutions intended to give educated provincial elites a stake in the imperial system. Instead, when the moment of crisis came, those same assemblies became the organizational structure through which provincial elites announced their break with Beijing. The new army units that joined the revolution had been created and trained by the Qing specifically to defend the imperial government. Instead, they became the revolutionary military force that overthrew it. The railway crisis of 1911. The Regent Prince Chun's decision to nationalize the privately funded railways of Sichuan, Hubei, Hunan, and Guangdong, compensating shareholders with government bonds that were worth less than the money investors had already lost on construction, had alienated the gentry, merchants, and middle-class investors who represented exactly the social groups the Qing needed to retain if it was going to survive as a constitutional monarchy. The railway protection movement in Sichuan had turned from a business dispute into a mass political protest. When the Qing deployed troops from the Hubei New Army garrison to Sichuan to suppress the Sichuan protests, it thinned the Hubei garrison at exactly the moment when the revolutionary cells there were preparing to act. Yuan Shikai had been waiting for precisely this moment since 1909. He was the most powerful Han Chinese official in the empire, the man who had built the Beiyang army into the most effective military force in China by treating it as his personal instrument. The Regent Prince Chun had dismissed him in 1909, sending him home on the pretext of a leg ailment requiring rest, partly because he feared Yuan's power and partly because he wanted to put Manchu princes in control of the key military and governmental positions. Yuan spent 2 years at his estate in Hainan, ostensibly fishing and enjoying retirement, actually following events with intense attention and waiting for the moment when his services would be indispensable. When the Wuchang uprising succeeded and provincial declarations of independence began accumulating, the regent discovered that there was no one else who could command the Beiyang army effectively. Yuan Shikai was recalled. He extracted terms before agreeing to return. He wanted command of all military forces, control of military appropriations, permission to raise additional troops, and lifting of all restrictions on his political activities. He got most of what he asked for. He then conducted the negotiations of the final weeks of the dynasty with consummate skill, fighting the revolutionary forces hard enough in central China to demonstrate that they could not win a clear military victory while simultaneously communicating to the revolutionary leadership in Nanjing that he could deliver the Qing's peaceful abdication in exchange for being made president of the republic. That would replace it. Sun Yat-sen stepped down from the provisional presidency on February 13, 1912, the day after the abdication. Yuan Shikai was inaugurated as President of the Republic of China on February 15th. He moved the capital from Nanjing back to Beijing, where his military strength was centered. He immediately began dismantling the democratic institutions Sun Yat-sen had tried to establish. On February 12, 1912, Empress Dowager Longyu, the widow of Emperor Guangzhou, serving as regent on behalf of the 6-year-old Puyi, read the abdication edict aloud. The document had been drafted by Zhang Jian, a former examination champion turned industrialist turned constitutionalist who had gone from being one of the king's most decorated scholars to one of its sharpest critics. The edict was gracious and dignified in tone. It acknowledged that the mood of the people had changed, that the time for constitutional monarchy had passed, that the republic was now the form of government the Chinese people wished to have. It thanked the Qing ancestors for their centuries of service to China and commended the welfare of the Chinese people to the new government. Puyi, age 6, was in a neighboring room with his nurses and tutors, playing unaware of what was happening. He was allowed to retain the title Emperor of the Great Qing within the confines of the Forbidden City, to continue to receive the honors due to a foreign sovereign when foreign diplomats called, to keep his household intact at government expense, to maintain his ancestral temples and the imperial tombs. He continued to live in the Forbidden City for 12 more years, in a gilded and increasingly anachronistic captivity, surrounded by eunuchs and court ladies and tutors who kept the forms of imperial ceremony alive in a world that had moved irrevocably past them. He was expelled in 1924 by the warlord Feng Yuxiang, who had decided that the continued existence of the imperial household in Beijing was a symbol that the new China could no longer afford. Puyi was 18 years old and had never in his life been outside the walls of the Forbidden City. What ended on February 12, 1912, was not merely the Qing Dynasty. It was the end of a form of political civilization that had organized human life in the most populous corner of the world for longer than any other governing idea in history. The concept of the Son of Heaven. The single ruler whose virtue connected the human world to cosmic order, whose legitimacy was demonstrated by the prosperity of the realm and withdrawn by natural disaster and popular rebellion, who governed through a hierarchy of scholar officials selected by competitive examination of their moral and intellectual formation. This idea had survived everything that history had thrown at it for 2,133 years. It had survived military defeat. It had survived dynastic collapse. It had survived foreign conquest. It had survived famines that killed tens of millions. It had survived ideological challenges from Buddhism, Taoism, and eventually Christianity. It had survived the Mongols. It had survived the Manchus. It had not survived the combination of Western imperial pressure and its own inability to adapt to a world organized around nation-states, industrial economics, popular sovereignty, and modern military technology. The Qing fell because it could not find a way to modernize without destroying the power structures that the people at the top of the Qing political system needed to survive. And by the time those people were dead and their successors willing to try, it was too late. The examination system had been abolished. The new educated class had no stake in the imperial order. The regional military commanders had no loyalty to Beijing. The financial system was mortgaged to foreign creditors. The emperor was a 6-year-old boy with an incompetent regent. And in a rented room in Hankou, some soldiers who were about to be arrested for treason decided they had nothing left to lose. The last emperor outlived the empire by 55 years. Puyi was installed as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo by the Japanese in 1934, a bitter irony. The Manchu ruler of a puppet Manchu state in the Manchu homeland, controlled by Japan, the power that had begun the humiliation of China in 1894. He held that title until August 1945, when the Soviet invasion of Manchuria caught him trying to flee to Japan in an airplane, and Soviet soldiers took him into custody. He was held in the Soviet Union for 5 years, then handed to the People's Republic of China in 1950, where he was imprisoned and subjected to a decade of political re-education. Marxist study sessions, self-criticism exercises, the entire apparatus of communist thought reform. In Fushun War Criminals Management Center. He was released in 1959 as a reformed citizen of the People's Republic. He worked as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden. He remarried. He wrote his memoirs, which became the source material for Bernardo Bertolucci's 1987 film The Last Emperor, which won 9 Academy Awards and introduced Puyi's extraordinary life to audiences worldwide. He joined guided tours of the Forbidden City and walked through the halls where he had been emperor as a child, listening to guides describe the building's history to tourists. He died in 1967, at 61 years old, during the Cultural Revolution. The upheaval that Mao Zedong unleashed against the remnants of traditional Chinese culture and the generation that had grown up before the Communist Revolution. He was buried as a citizen. He had been born as the son of heaven, the inheritor of 2,000 years of imperial tradition, the latest in the line of the most enduring political institution in human history, and he died as a gardener in a country that had abolished everything he had been born into. The bomb that went off by accident in Hankou in October 1911 had ended an empire. What it had begun was still being worked out a century later.